When I was in college, I had a wonderful experience at a summer convention of the U.S. National Student Association, which was a big influence on my early life when I was an undergraduate. And my first experience with USNSA was a summer convention when I was a sophomore in college at the University of Minnesota. Staying in one of the top floor dorms in Pioneer Hall in a charming little dormer room with a view of the campus, and I fell in love with the place. I just thought it was the most spectacular campus. I walked all over, back and forth across campus, and learned how to get across the old arched Washington Avenue Bridge to a little bar on the other side of the Mississippi River on the West Bank that if you were tall enough to put a quarter on the bar, you could buy a cold beer, and then walk through the West Bank when it was a music center. The West Bank is at the edge of the liquor patrol limits, which is why all the bars are along Cedar Avenue. The city would allow bars to be within walking distance for a policeman from City Hall to walk there, patrol, and walk back. So that was the liquor patrol limits, was the border of the West Bank, which is why all the bars are in the West Bank and Dinkytown. You could walk there. And that suited me. That was pretty cool when you're a sophomore. So I walked through the West Bank, and the university had not jumped the river. It was a charming, seedy, old bohemian community. And the furthest northern point on the Mississippi River where the riverboats could navigate before they hit St. Anthony Falls. So that's as far as the boats got. They stopped there. And they wintered in Bohemian Flats, which are the flats along the river. And the Czech riverboat people lived on the West Bank. So the combination of the riverboats and the liquor patrol limits and Czech and Russian and black immigrants living in that community gave rise to the West Bank. That was its origin and its background. And I was in heaven. I mean, this was a kid from Southern California who had been living a suburban life, discovering the beauty of the city and the beauty of variety for the first time. And I loved the place. And then I walked across the Franklin Avenue Bridge and looked back at the campus, which is a spectacular view down the Mississippi River to the campus, around through Dinkytown and back to Pioneer Hall. So that was my daily route for about 2 weeks when I was at this convention. And I met students from, at that time, the Soviet Union and Europe and Asia, all over the place. This was a national student convention. And that stimulated my interest in politics, that got my juices going. I wanted to study the world politically, and that was the start of learning to love the West Bank. Not too much later than that, I went to a number of summer conventions of USNSA afterwards. At one at the University of Maryland, I was elected to the National Supervisory Board of the National Student Association. And my roommate, Sam Brown, became chair of the National Supervisory Board. Sam went on to fight the Olympics in Colorado. He became head of the Peace Corps under President Carter. He was the head of the moratorium against the war, and later on the head of Students for McCarthy. And Sam and I were best buddies. We were on the National Supervisory Board together in Washington. And I ended up wanting to go to graduate school in politics. My advisor at the University of Redlands in Southern California got his PhD at the University of Minnesota in politics and wrote a book on the Nonpartisan League, which is an old movement, a populist movement in the Dakotas and Minnesota against the bankers and the big financial conglomerates. And he encouraged me to go to Minnesota because it had a radical reputation. in politics. And so I had this wonderful mentor who went to Minnesota. I had a summer there and a great experience. And then at a summer institute, one of the other NSA conventions after I graduated as an undergraduate, I met a guy named Howie Keibel, who was student body president at the University of Minnesota. And Howie is a great old West Bank character. Howie said, if you're coming to Minnesota, you're going to live on the West Bank a block from me, and we're going to organize the West Bank politically for McCarthy. And I said, yes, sir, whatever you say, just give me a map of the neighborhood and I'll go knock on doors. And so that's what we did. I landed at the Milwaukee Road Depot when the train still went in there. And it was cold and crisp and beautiful, and found a little one-room flat on the West Bank and started going door to door. I barely knew for what, but for what in Minnesota is to organize people to go to the precinct caucuses. Precinct caucuses, who knew what that was? I was from California. Precinct caucuses are where people go to a meeting at a church basement and they elect the president of the candidate for your party to be president of the United States. It takes people to physically walk there on the night of the caucus. And that was all totally new. So the first thing I did when I got to Minnesota for graduate school was I enrolled, which was the technical part of being a graduate student. But I learned politics. I learned what it meant to go door to door, to organize the neighborhood on the West Bank. And that became the core of everything I did for years after that, is organizing people to do things. And that's what my story is about, is the feeling that the satisfaction that you get out of learning that. I read a lot of books in graduate school and loved it. I had a great time and found out about politics by trying to organize people to go to caucuses against the war. The other person who was the chief of the neighborhood operation was Vance Opperman, who was he was a law student with Howie Keibel and Bob Metcalf on the West Bank. Vance is now one of the most prominent and distinguished people in Minnesota, maybe the richest. He owns huge companies. He owns the Wild hockey team. He's a very prominent, he's a great lawyer, prominent organizer. But Vance and Howie and I and many others would meet in Vance's living room and decide what block we were going to hit to try to find people who were against the war. And we would go out door to door, knock on a door and say, what's your feeling about the war? And if they were of an attitude that they would do something about it, then we would take their name, the address, and say, we're going to come back the night of the caucus and make sure that you caucus for McCarthy. So that's how we started organizing. And I met everybody who lived on the West Bank through the McCarthy movement, organizing for the precinct caucuses. And that was just outside of the realm of politics that I had ever really known much about. When I was then in graduate school and doing this stuff on the West Bank, I was involved with USNSA and had signed a petition when I was in Washington that was organized by Allard Lowenstein, who became a congressman and a very left-wing anti-war organizer. At a summer conference before I came to Minnesota, he said, we're going to organize the Dump Johnson movement. And I said, okay, that sounds great. How do you do that? And he said, in Minnesota, you do it by organizing people to go to the precinct caucuses. In Wisconsin, you do it by going door to door, getting them to vote in the Wisconsin primary for Eugene McCarthy. So I went to Wausau, Wisconsin, and went door to door in rural Wausau, trying to find people who would vote against Johnson in the Wisconsin primary that was coming up. So the Minnesota caucuses and the Wisconsin primary were key stumbling blocks for LBJ to become nominated as the Democratic candidate for president, and we were organizing against him. And that organizing started on the West Bank. When I was sitting in an organizing room in the winter of '67 probably, having spent 2 days going door to door, farmhouse to farmhouse in rural Wisconsin, trying to convince people to vote for McCarthy, LBJ came on the television. And all of these tired organizers who had been going door to door were sitting in a room. And Johnson said, after about 20 minutes explaining his approach to the war and why he was committed to it, he said, "And my final conclusion is that I shall not seek nor shall I accept the Democratic nomination for president." And the place erupted. Having spent all that time the day before the Wisconsin primary, he knew it was over. And we felt that we had knocked him out of the race because we had turned the tables in Wisconsin for the Wisconsin primary, and it was the couple of days before the Wisconsin primary that he dropped out. So that was satisfying. That's what politics was all about. So I was interested in politics. I took all this stuff back to the Minnesota, was all jazzed up about telling everybody at the Department of Political Science what power was all about. And the difference between I was talking about structural functionalism and economic models of political power that had nothing to do with real power that was happening out there on the street and in the door-to-door activity of Wisconsin. That was the context that I came to the West Bank with, is how to organize. There was another piece of that I wanted to throw into the hopper. At the same time, when I was on the National Supervisory Board, every 3 or 4 months we would go to Washington and have a board meeting. I was elected the treasurer of the U.S. National Student Association. One of the meetings that I went to in the middle of the winter in January '67, when all this other anti-war stuff was going on, the fundraiser, the development officer of USNSA, approached me. And I was treasurer of the National Supervisory Board, signing checks, looking at budgets, being very intelligent. And he said, "Do you know where your money comes from?" And I said, "Well, of course I do. It's the Foundation for Youth and Student Affairs, Crossroads Africa." And I named all the foundations. And he said, "Have you ever been to one of those foundations?" And I said, "Well, no, I'm only in Washington for a couple of days. I haven't had time to visit. That's your job, And he said, "Go find one. When you're here, take another couple of days, stay in Washington and go find one." So I did, and I tried to find one. And from the list of all the sources of money that went into the U.S. National Student Association, couldn't find one foundation that actually had an office or a place or anything. And I came back to Michael Wood, was his name, smart guy. He said, "You should go to a meeting of the board of the writers of Ramparts magazine tomorrow night. Ask them about it." So I went to this meeting of the staff writers of Ramparts magazine, which was an old-time radical, iconoclastic magazine. Great, one of the best magazines, in American political history. And they said, "Well, what do you mean you don't know where Of course, it comes from the Central Intelligence Agency. Didn't you know that?" And I said, "No, I did not know that." And he said, "Ramparts cover story next month is going to say USNSA for the last 20 years has been financed by the Central Intelligence Agency. Didn't you know?" And I said, "No, I didn't, sorry." And he said, "Well, you're treasurer of the Supervisory Board." And I said, "That's a figurehead position." And he said, "You better look into it." I went back to the office in Washington and called Sam Brown. Sam, the head of Students for McCarthy. Sam was at the Rutgers Institute for Practical Politics, or he was on his way to Harvard Divinity School, and I'm not sure which, but I think those two kind of typify Sam's approach to politics. is theology and practical politics. I called Sam and said, I heard from writers who are going to publish a news story in Ramparts that the CIA funds US NSA. What do you think? I think you should come to Washington. Sam was in Washington the next day. We went to the officers of US NSA, the elected officers, and said, we got a problem here. Is the CIA financing us? That kind of compromises our independence. And the officers said, not a chance, no way. We all went home. I went back to Minnesota. A week later, I got a call, you got to come back to Washington. Went back to Washington, and the officers said, it's true. We have known this for 15 years. The president of US NSA every year for 15 years has been told by the Central Intelligence Agency that there is a very secret piece of information that you need to know to function as the president of NSA. If you say it's okay for us to tell you, you must swear that you will not make this public. If you do not swear, we won't tell you, and you will not be able to function effectively. Every president of the National Student Association for 15 years said, I will not go public. What's the secret? They couldn't resist. And they were told that the Central Intelligence Agency finances the agency. Sam got the supervisory board together. We went to the New York Times and said, we're going public before Ramparts. We held a conference, a press conference in Washington. We invited the Washington Post, the New York Times, front page of the New York Times, CIA finances the National Student Association. I went back to Minnesota with that bad taste of the federal government in my mouth. And Hubert Humphrey, now being the candidate in favor of the war from Minnesota, Eugene McCarthy being against the war from Minnesota, the Central Intelligence Agency financing the organization that I had spent 3 years working for. And I felt like I had been stabbed in the back, ethically, by people who I trusted. And it just added to a feeling that we have to take over the politics of this country. And it just added gasoline to our fire, our political prairie fire of organizing in the neighborhood. Hubert Humphrey gained his prominence in Minnesota by throwing the communists out of City Hall. He was fanatically in favor of the war in Vietnam. Howie and I went back to Washington once and met. We said, we're from Minnesota. We'd like to meet. We'd like a few minutes with the vice president. We wanted to talk to him about the war. There was a huge protest going on outside. We met in the executive office of the vice president with Hubert Humphrey when he was vice president, now knowing that he was going to run for president. And we said, Hubert, do you really think this is the right thing for us to be doing? I didn't say Hubert, I'm sorry. I probably said Mr. Vice President. And he shakingly put his hand out the window and said, look at those people. Why aren't they back in their hometown doing other kinds of work for the party? Why are they here protesting? You could kiss Ho Chi Minh's ass and he wouldn't do anything that's correct for that country. And he exploded for half an hour. Howie and I left saying, I don't think we're going to convince him. So we went back knowing that Vice President Humphrey was adamantly in favor of the war and that he would prosecute it with all the energy in his soul when we went back to Minnesota. So that was the flavor of the times that I took to the motivation of organizing politically on the West Bank for the precinct caucuses. And that gave me an opportunity to meet all the people on the West Bank. At the same time, in 1968, the Democratic Convention was held in Chicago. I was at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, which was a disaster for protest and for the fight between the Chicago police and the anti-war movement. And we were tear gassed and terrified by the actions of the police. At the same year that USNSA discovered the Central Intelligence Agency, the city of Minneapolis organized and passed an urban renewal plan for the West Bank, calling for total clearance of the neighborhood, the elimination of the neighborhood. So we were now organizing in a neighborhood that the city and HUD had decided was going to be bulldozed with federal funds. At the same time, the New Communities Board of HUD agreed to lend Cedar Riverside Associates, which was the developer, the private developer of the new town in town on the West Bank, $24 million to remove blight of the neighborhood. We lived in the neighborhood. Nobody had asked us about that. And the principle of citizen participation was powerful at that time. People should be consulted about their future. And the West Bank was confronted with a situation where the funds from HUD were going to be used to level the neighborhood for a private developer. That, in conjunction with the anti-war movement was going on, left a high level of distrust of the federal government in our minds, and led to very instant organizing after the convention in 1970 and 1971 of the West Bank community. And it was a combination of that feeling that the federal government was pushing us around through HUD and through the war in Vietnam, that it didn't work, and we organized the neighborhood to take over the community and not approve of the elimination of our neighborhood with the use of federal funds. So in 1971, the New Communities Program actually signed a check for $24 million to the Cedar Riverside Associates, was a private development company that had quietly been buying up land around the West Bank. Keith Heller was a professor of real estate investment in the evening school at the university, and he has been buying up land. Gloria Siegel was a partner. They formed Cedar Riverside Associates. They got a $24 million loan guarantee to acquire land to assemble the new town in town in the West Bank. And that happened in 71 at the same time that we had just gone through this period of anti-war protest, in which, that's a whole nother, these are all the same story. All this, it blends together in a way that was called, we are opposed to economic imperialism at home and abroad. That was one of our clever little slogans. That this is all part of the same story, the corporate takeover of everything. Stage one, Cedar Square West, was built and mostly finished by 1972, and it was there was a dedication ceremony that was emceed by George Romney, who had been a prominent promoter of the war. He came to Minneapolis to dedicate Cedar Square West right after he had been on his way back from Vietnam, extolling the power of the military in Vietnam. On his return trip, he stopped in Minneapolis to dedicate Cedar Square West. That connection was all we needed. The whole city of Minneapolis in 1971 and 72 exploded in anti-war protest. And there are videos of riots between the police and anti-war protesters. We organized to confront Romney on the front of Cedar Square West, a meeting of Marv Davidoff, who came from Dinkytown, who organized a huge protest movement that marched across the Washington Avenue Bridge and joined the protest from the West Bank that we organized. Thousands of people together protested the dedication of Cedar Square West in 1972. And from that energy, we organized various projects, of which I am especially proud of how the West Bank responded to that time, which is to say that protest by itself can be temporarily satisfying. It's not enough. You gotta propose a different view of the world. At that time, when the New Communities program was being funded, the People's Pantry was organized. Susie Schroyer and others that you may run across during some of these interviews. The People's Pantry was organized as a bulk food buying organization on the front porch of their friend's house. Also at the same time, the People's Center, a medical center on the West Bank, I chaired the first meeting of the community to organize the People's Center. We called it the Community Union. The Community Union was our organic organizing instrument. We organized the board of the People's Center. The People's Center was a dedicated group of nurses and medical students who organized a walk-in clinic when Dr. Judy was no longer able to provide a free walk-in medical service. The People's Center was born in 71. Same time the People's Pantry was born that became North Country Food Co-op, and these structures became the core service components of the West Bank. At that time, the war protest in 72 became vociferous and violent, and in 1973 we decided we had to structurally take over the neighborhood through some means of actual ownership. So we formed the West Bank Community Development Corporation. So the West Bank CDC was a neighborhood development company to start developing our own vision of housing on the West Bank. The People's Pantry became North Country Foods, a co-op housing, a co-op food organization, and the People's Center became a medical center that was award-winning and still is one of the finest community clinics in Minneapolis. As the last step during that period of time, I organized the Cedar Riverside Environmental Defense Fund. The Cedar Riverside Environmental Defense Fund was the legal strategy against Cedar Riverside Associates, which has now started the development of 10 acres on the West Bank, which is called Stage 1, Cedar Square West, and that was built and was under construction. Because it required a substantial amount of federal money, there was an environmental impact statement that was prepared to defend the decision to build extremely high-density, high-rise housing on the West Bank and to remove all other housing. 1/10 of it is what you see in Riverside Plaza, which is on the West Bank now. 39-story high-rise McKnight Tower. It's about 15 buildings on 10 acres of land, 1,303 units of housing that CRA developed, which is a density divided by 10 acres of 130 units an acre in high-density housing. And because of the financing was required to house a substantial number of families with children, we felt this was not wise, that this was not good planning, it was not good environmental design, and there were alternatives that would be highly preferable to high-rise, high-density housing if HUD looked at those alternatives. So through the environmental impact statement approval process, as neighborhood organizers, we presented alternatives for physical development of the neighborhood. So we had a community health care center, we had a food co-op, we had a neighborhood housing development company in the West Bank CDC, and a legal strategy to block the private developer. We filed suit against HUD in 1973 because of the inadequacy of the environmental impact statement. And a great deal of my time and energy for the next few years was spent on that lawsuit because we sued the federal government, Cedar Riverside Associates, Cedar Riverside Land Company, and it included University Court Apartments in Dinkytown that CRA also owned, and some other buildings where they had acquired property on the other side. During that time, I'm not sure what the date is, I'll have to check when this occurred. In 75, I'll have to look at the date for that. I can look that up. In the middle 70s, Cedar Riverside Associates announced a across-the-board rent increase of about 50% for everybody living on the West Bank. And from that, the neighborhood again erupted in protest and organized the East-West Bank Tenants Union, and we organized a huge rent strike on the West Bank that blocked Cedar Riverside from collecting rent on the West Bank. And during that process, they tried to evict commercial tenants who were standing in their way of acquiring and demolishing all the commercial property along Cedar Avenue. The West Bank CDC was proposing alternative development options, and the tenants union, which had the symbol of the black cat, the wobbly black, the black cat, collected all the rent, and we went to court and fought the evictions on the West Bank. And the new Riverside Cafe was one of the entities that was going to get eliminated. Bill Teska, Reverend Bill Teska, an Episcopalian minister, a leader ethically and organizationally of all of the activity that I've been talking about, organized the new Riverside Cafe, and they had a building on the corner of Riverside and Cedar that was owned then by Cedar Riverside Associates. They got eviction notices. They refused to be evicted. They withheld their rent. Cedar Riverside Associates took the new Riverside Cafe to the Minnesota Supreme Court. The new Riverside Cafe paid back the back rent on the condition that they be allowed. One of the things you do in unlawful detainer court is you pay the rent. When you do that, then you have the right to remain in your unit. There's no action of eviction that can happen if you pay the rent. The community union helped the new Riverside Cafe to collect enough money to pay the back rent. When they paid the back rent, Cedar Riverside Associates refused to accept it. And they said, we don't want the back rent. We want to take them, we want to evict them. New Riverside Cafe took that to court. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Cedar Riverside Associates on June 30th. Cedar Riverside Associates wins their appeal at the Supreme Court to evict the New Riverside Cafe. On July 1st, the next day, HUD forecloses on Cedar Riverside Associates and removes them as the owner of the Newtown in-town property, which had been in the works since 1973. CRA defaulted on their new community loan in 1974. HUD started foreclosure measures that we didn't know about in 1973, and we learned about it later on. In 1978, HUD forecloses on the mortgages on Cedar Riverside Associates. They remove CRA from ownership. The new Riverside Cafe stays in place the next day. And there was a celebration that night. The neighborhood knew how to party. And those symbolic, the juxtaposition of the private developer and the neighborhood organizing just comes into focus as to how tense that was. This was, are you going to stay or not? At the same time, in late 1977, actually in 1976, CREDF, the Cedar Riverside Environmental Defense Fund, that filed the environmental lawsuit against HUD and Cedar Riverside Associates, wins our case in the district court. We won. The district court in federal court took the challenge to the adequacy of the environmental impact statement, and we won. And the special judge who Judge Miles Lord. Now there's a name of a populist judge that everybody should remember. He knew what was going on here, and his opinion is terrific. The opinion of the special master, as it called, Judge Miles Lord, was too busy to hear the case. He knew the case against HUD and CRA was going to take a long time with lots of professional testimony. Lord knew that this had to be heard by a special master. He heard the case. The special master ruled significantly and substantially against HUD, saying that the environmental impact statement was completely inadequate, did not evaluate a range of better alternatives in terms of environmental impact, social and psychological impact on the people who live there, energy efficiency. We had a great number of good national authorities in urban design and architecture and human psychology who testified for us. The special master said when he was asked to take this case at the start because of the anti-neighborhood publicity that had been generated through the Star and Tribune in Minneapolis, that he didn't expect us to win at all. He thought this was going to be an open and shut case in favor of the federal government. HUD is not a bad organization. Most of what HUD does is good. They provide affordable housing to most people. The special master did not expect us to win. By the time the case was over, he was totally convinced and wrote an astounding opinion that said the environmental review of Cedar Square West was totally inadequate. The environmental proposal for stage 2, the next stage, was completely inadequate. He enjoined any further funds going into the neighborhood and refused to authorize the city or the federal government to spend another dime until they answered the substantive conclusions of urban design and architectural design in his opinion that were inadequate in the environmental impact statement. And so Cedar Riverside Associates had no more money. They were frozen. It was financially unfeasible. CRA turned around and sued the city of Minneapolis and HUD for not giving them the money they thought they deserved in a separate lawsuit. And that went to district court. That was Cedar Riverside Associates versus Minneapolis Housing and Redevelopment versus the city of Minneapolis and versus HUD. So CRA turns around and sues the federal government for not giving them any money. You should read the opinion of that court after CRA lost that federal case that they appealed. That the federal government, the judge in that case said, the federal government is not obligated to a private developer if there are substantive problems, and if they are in default. HUD is designed to provide housing and will provide money to build housing, not to finance the future of a private developer. And it was a populist opinion that I have copies of that is astounding. That the special prosecutor in our case agreed with our position on what is the right environment for children to live in, not high-rise housing, that the city is not obligated to continue financing a private developer just because the private developer is having financial trouble. That is not good enough. And CRA was removed from the property after that final appeal. So CRA sues the city of Minneapolis, MHRA, and HUD in 1979. The final official foreclosure, by the time the city took back title to the land, where they got quitclaim deeds from CRA on the land in the West Bank, was in 1986, when the final issue finally got resolved. In 1986, the city of Minneapolis rewrote the urban renewal plan to say, let's look at some alternatives. Oh, what a good idea. We said that in 1973. In 1986, the city of Minneapolis, after all this, finally said, we're going to change the urban renewal plan and say, we are open to suggestion. The urban renewal plan now had actual citizen participation in it. And it took more than a petition to the federal government to accomplish that. When we formed the Cedar Riverside Project Area Committee, which is the official HUD thing where you create a community, a group of people who have meetings and they talk to city officials and they learn what the urban renewal plans are all about. The citizen participation branch of the city of Minneapolis through the PAC, the Project Area Committee, was formed during this discourse that I just went through in the middle 70s. HUD refused to form one in 1974 and 75 when we started asking for a neighborhood review board to review federal expenditures. We had a friend who was working for the HUD area office in Chicago, Charles Warner, who at night, and Charlie is proud of this, as a HUD official, he did a little after-hours work at the Xerox machine. We had every piece of correspondence and every internal memo from the HUD regional office in Chicago sent to us. So we knew exactly what HUD was doing. And their decision not to officially recognize a Project Area Committee in the middle 70s when they should have done it was because they had determined that the West Bank was a total clearance area. Remember, I had said something about that in the urban renewal plan. It was going to be removed. We, therefore, those of us who lived there, did not exist by definition. Because we lived in a blighted area, there was no constituency in the West Bank to ask their opinion about the future of their being removed from the West Bank, because by definition we didn't exist. That, combined with everything else that I'm talking about, was just more than you can imagine for a group of people who felt like things from the federal government were not going well. And this is also by people who believe in the necessity of a strong federal government for the purpose of social justice. That was part of the dilemma here. This is not a posse comitatus. This is not the insanity of anti-government feelings today. This is the feeling that the government can do the right thing if it is made to, and we want to shape that. It was a complex feeling of, we love our community. We were a tribe. There is a lot of writing these days in anthropology about tribalism and that feeling of collective. When you don't have a distinguished tribe like a Native American tribe, but you have an urban tribe of people in a community that take pride. There is an ethnic pride in the West Bank that may come out from other people that you've talked to, Peter. In terms of music and ethnicity and language and culture that hold the West Bank together in a very unique way. And that tribalism is part of what made us so strong together. But it wasn't against the federal government. It was tangential to it. You're smart people. You don't need to do this. The Cedar Riverside Associates doesn't know how to be urban planners. They're playing with toys. They liked the models. They liked to go to the new town in town in Finland, Tapiola, that Heikki von Hertzen designed, and they thought, oh, this is beautiful. They went to Paris and they looked at the high-rise apartments of Corbusier, and they loved to say Corbusier was our inspiration. And they had pictures of high-rise apartments with little colored squares in France on the sides. An architect for Ralph Repson, who was the chief architect, the chair of the School of Architecture at the university, was proud of the little colored squares on the side of the high-rise buildings on the West Bank because of the Corbusier model. And they actually said that when a resident stands on the ground and looks at the high-rise and can count up, and these, if you've seen Riverside Plaza, you know that it's kind of a random beehive sort of looking thing with squares here and there, primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, I think. And each one of those you can spot, and when you're standing on the ground, according to one of the architects who was working with Repson, said, a resident can stand on the ground and look at this blue square that's on the 13th floor, count 3 doors over, and say, that's where I live. And that was the human connection to and that was, I heard this not too long ago, actually, and it's, you gotta be kidding, that's crazy. But that was the connection, that it identified space that people could relate to visually. Well, our expert witness on trial of the impact statement, the finest architect I've run across, Professor Claire Cooper Marcus from the School of Landscape Architecture at the University of California at Berkeley, did an anthropologist bringing the knowledge of anthropology to architecture, said, and has written some beautiful books about the design of family housing in England around U-shaped structures that allow parents, though medium density is necessary for economics, everybody can't live in a single family home. There is some advantage in living collectively. As long as collectively everybody can see the entrance and they know who's coming in and they can see their kid playing in the playground. That's called defensible space. There was a book written called Defensible Space in the 70s. And Cedar Square West violates every single principle of defensible space imaginable. If you were given a seminar project in the School of Architecture about how to design something that is totally and completely indefensible structurally, it is Cedar Square West. Perfect. You can't tell who belongs there and who doesn't. And it has become a source of housing for immigrant populations coming to the United States. The argument for it is that it provides 1,303 units of affordable housing. And that is true. It is a resource, and it's a very difficult resource to replace. If you tore it down, nobody's going to build 1,303 units of affordable housing somewhere else or in a medium density. It's there. We know it's there. When it went into foreclosure in 1986, HUD appointed a receiver for it that was based in Washington, D.C. And for the next many years, it fell into disrepair. By the middle 1996, 97, 98, the maintenance was bad. They were way behind. They weren't paying their water bill. The mortgage was held by, it was a HUD-held property in foreclosure. Nobody was running it, and it was about 50% occupied. I had been working for a co-op developer in San Francisco, returned to Minneapolis in the late 1990s, and of course went straight to the West Bank I mean, like a little homing pigeon. I went back to the neighborhood that I knew and thought that somebody should run this place. Here is the 1,303 units that is in disrepair and has federal subsidies tied to it and is a mess and is crime-ridden and is notorious for not being well handled. Somebody should run this. And I said, well, why not the West Bank? Why not us? Why not a group of developers from Minneapolis? So I asked Dick Brewstead, who was the late Dick Brewstead, a wonderful guy and the head of Brighton Development, who was the partner with all of the other neighborhood groups that formed co-ops of the other housing in the neighborhood that I managed cooperatively. I asked Brewstead, would your development company be interested in buying Riverside Plaza? And that was like, who would want to buy that? It was a mess. And I said, it's there. Somebody's got to deal with this. It's in our neighborhood and we have to take care of it. So Brewstead thought it was okay. His two partners thought he was crazy. So we went to the city and said, how do we get our hands on this thing? And the city of Minneapolis said, we would consider helping you buy it if you include in your partnership any legitimate private developer or nonprofit that is interested in becoming a partner in running Riverside Plaza, Cedar Square West, well, taking it over and running it locally instead of from Washington. If you do that, then we'll help you buy it. George, and the city told me that George Sherman, who was a distinguished and extremely competent private developer, was interested possibly in looking at the acquisition. I called George and said, I heard you're interested. You want to become a partner? George jumped at it. George, Brighton, the Family Housing Fund, which is a nonprofit formed by the mayors of Minneapolis and St. Paul with some resources behind it. We brought in as our community government-based representative nonprofit on the board. And we asked the Tenant Association if they'd be interested in being a partner. Riverside Plaza Tenants Association was an association of the partners, of the residents of Riverside Plaza, and they are a partner. We formed a partnership and my company, because I did a teeny little bit of ownership of the general partnership based on my net worth, which was my checkbook of a few dollars that, because I had helped organize the thing and spent the last 20 years trying to do something with the property, became a general partner in the partnership. We convinced the city council of the city of Minneapolis to go to HUD, and we found a provision in federal regulations that said a public entity, if there is a set of criteria for improving property and there are no other alternative resources and the property is in foreclosure and HUD owns the property, a public entity like the city of Minneapolis may negotiate the purchase of property held by HUD. It doesn't have to go to competitive bid, which is what we wanted to avoid. We knew that there were other parties interested in competitively bidding it to take it over and run it down, bleed it. We didn't want that to happen because it's still, it's part of the West Bank. So the city, with our partnership, went to HUD and said, sell it to us. We're going to negotiate a deal. We negotiated a deal. The city bought it for $17 million. Not a bad price. We agreed to put $65 million into it by the syndication of low-income housing tax credits. So we brought investors in, we put in $65 million to fix it up. The partnership ran it until 2010. We needed to re-syndicate and bring more money in. Riverside Plaza, because it was now old, and because it had this distinguished history of architectural notoriety, now qualified to be listed on the list of historic landmarks. This property that we had criticized ground up as a disaster architecturally, now, because of its infamy, and because it had a group of distinguished architects associated with it, qualified as an historic landmark. That has some side benefits. The side benefit is that historic designation generates historic preservation tax credits. We sold the property to another group of investors for $134 million. Remember, the city bought it for $17 million. We put 65 into it. We re-syndicated it and completely re-renovated. The new owners, of which I am not a part, re-renovated. George Sherman is now the managing general partner of the new entity. Redid the entire property and really did a good job with it. One of the things we discovered when I was a partner, just as an example of the difficulty of running that property, there were high-rise buildings on the West Bank, the McKnight Towers. They designed it with 6 elevator shafts. They built it with 6 elevator shafts. To save money, they only actually put in 3 elevators because elevators were too expensive. And they ran all the utilities down the chute that was extremely convenient. Well, here's this huge hole in the center of the McKnight Tower. You can run power, water, and sewer down this elevator shaft. Who needs an elevator? The waiting time on the 3 elevators when we were general partners was about 15-20 minutes for people trying to go to work in Riverside, out of McKnight Tower. I mean, these are just horror stories. There's dozens of them. But what we did, because the elevator shafts were full of utility runs, we built an elevator on the outside of McKnight. We just built an elevator shaft up the side of the building and poked holes in the building so that people could get into it. And that actually worked pretty well. So there were some things that the new partners did. It's now being run extremely well. All but about 129 units under George Sherman's direction are, most of the units are affordable at people with 60% of income or less. George has done a terrific job with it. And the next round of immigration into the city is taking advantage of the property. When the Somali and Ethiopian population started moving in, then there was a significant amount of crime in the early years. There was a great deal of difficulty before good security was put into the property. The New York Times relished in telling stories about Somali kids being recruited as jihadists into Somali gangs and being sent back to Northeast Africa from Riverside Plaza. Riverside Plaza was called Little Mogadishu for the number of Somali people. There are 30,000 Somali people in the Twin Cities, many of whom live in Riverside Plaza now. 30,000 is about 25% of the total Somali population in the United States. They live in the Twin Cities because they feel connected. There is a new sense of community being built in the Twin Cities around the East African the East Africa Development Corporation is now located in a building that I used to own on the West Bank that was once called the Maridel LeSueur Center for Peace and Justice, which was the home of Cedar Riverside Associates before they went bankrupt. I bought that building from Riverside, from the city, from the Housing and Redevelopment Authority, and sold it to the East African Development Corporation. So these things go through patterns. It's the pattern of, when you step back from it, it's the pattern of organizing and immigration that is so fascinating in a microcosm like the West Bank. And the Somali population is now anchored and doing well. And I must say, partly due to the influence of the Cedar Cultural Center, that has antecedents with Snooze Boulevard, with the Cultural Center of Music on the West Bank, the New Riverside Cafe, and now the Cedar Cultural Center, that has made a huge effort to bring Somali musicians onto the stage.